Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today I will offer an update on the case of Air India Flight 171. First, I'll look at the background of this case, including the timeline of the incident, move to a summary of the preliminary report, then offer my analysis. Air India Flight 171 was an international passenger flight that took off from the Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel International Airport in Ahmedabad, India, and was supposed to land at the London Gatwick Airport in the UK. The aircraft was a Boeing 787-8 Dreamliner, which was delivered to Air India in early 2014. On June 12, 2025, 242 people were on board the aircraft getting ready to make the 4,200-mile trip. At 1:38 p.m., the plane took off from runway 23. Both engines lost thrust. The aircraft reached a peak altitude of 625 feet and then started descending. At 1:39 p.m., 32 seconds after takeoff, the aircraft crashed into a populated area about a mile southeast of the airport. 241 of the 242 people on board were killed. One passenger survived, that was it. On July 11, 2025, about a month after the collision, the preliminary report was released by the Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau. Here is a summary of this report. The pilot in command was 56-year-old Captain Sumit Sabharwal. He had over 15,000 flying hours, including 8,500 hours on the Boeing 787. Almost all his time in that aircraft was as pilot in command. The co-pilot, 32-year-old Clive Kunder, had 3,400 hours of flying time, 1,100 hours on the Boeing 787. Both pilots had enough time for adequate rest before the flight, and both passed a breathalyzer test. They arrived at the boarding gate about an hour before takeoff. Air India Flight 171 took off at 1:38 p.m. and 39 seconds. The co-pilot was functioning as the pilot flying, and the pilot in command was the pilot monitoring. 3 or 4 seconds after takeoff, the fuel control switch for Engine 1 was moved from the run position to the cutoff position. 1 second later, the same thing happened with the switch for Engine 2. These switches sit between the pilots, positioned right below the thrust levers. They should not have been moved during takeoff. With the fuel flow now stopped, both engines lost thrust. One pilot asked the other pilot, why did he cut off? The other pilot responded that he did not do so. The report does not specify which pilot asked the question and which pilot issued the denial. At 1:38 p.m. and 52 seconds, the Engine 1 fuel control switch was moved from cutoff to run. 4 seconds later, the same thing was done with the Engine 2 fuel control switch. It appeared as though the pilots were trying to restore thrust to the engines. At 1:39 p.m. and 5 seconds, one of the pilots transmitted Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. 6 seconds later, the plane crashed. Again, this was just 32 seconds after takeoff. All this happened very quickly. When the wreckage was examined, investigators noted that both fuel control switches were in the run position, consistent with the flight recorder data. Both thrust levers were found near the idle position. However, data revealed that they remained forward until impact, so they were not actually in the idle position when the plane was in the air. They moved after the collision. The flap handle lever was in the correct position for takeoff, 5-degree flap position. The aircraft was not overweight, and the fuel was not contaminated. The investigation team had no recommended actions for those operating the Boeing 787-8 or General Electric next-generation engines. This is the type of engine that was installed on the crash aircraft. The investigation into the cause of the collision will continue. Now moving to my analysis. In light of the preliminary report, many of the original theories about the cause of this crash can now be put to rest. For example, the flaps were in the correct position, so this crash had nothing to do with the flaps. There is no evidence of a bird strike, the fuel was not contaminated, and this wasn't a single-engine failure where the functional engine was shut down by mistake. The preliminary report suggests that the plane crashed because fuel stopped flowing to both engines. The question, of course, is why? Was this human error? Was it sabotage? Did the computer shut the fuel off and the switches were never actually physically moved? Was there some other problem that the pilots were trying to fix? If the fuel control switches were working properly, they are almost impossible to move by accident. There is a locking mechanism designed to prevent them from moving unless somebody deliberately moves them. The operator must pull upward on the switch before it will move. If the switches were operating correctly and there were no problems with the computer, a fascinating, albeit morbid, logic puzzle emerges in this case. Let's take a look at this logic puzzle before moving to the new theories about the cause of the crash. As I mentioned, one of the pilots said to the other pilot something like, "Why did you cut off the fuel?" The other pilot responded by essentially saying, "I didn't." Based on the report, there is no way to know who asked the question and who issued the denial. Maybe the investigators don't know, or maybe they do know, but they were not compelled to share this information for any number of reasons. At first glance, one might assume that the pilot who asked the question was not the pilot who moved the switches into the cutoff position. The pilot who issued the denial must have been the guilty party, so to speak. The idea behind this assumption is that one of the pilots noticed the plane was losing thrust. He looked around quickly and saw that the fuel control switches were in the wrong position, or he simply saw the other pilot move the switches. Confused, he says to the other pilot, "Why did you cut off the fuel?" The other pilot denies doing this for one of a few reasons. He did not actually realize that he shut the fuel off. Maybe he thought he was operating some other control. He moved the switches by mistake and was too embarrassed to admit it. Or he moved the switches intentionally because he wanted to kill everyone on board that aircraft. He issued the denial because, in the unlikely event he survived, he wanted to have some defense available. He could have said he didn't know anything about the switch being moved. The other pilot must have done it. As I mentioned, that is the assumption one might make at first glance. But what about the other possible assumption? That is, the pilot who asked the question was actually the one who moved the fuel switches to the cutoff position. This means that the pilot who denied doing it was telling the truth. He didn't know anything about the fuel switches being moved. Under this assumption, the pilot who asked the question probably intended on committing murder. He was playing dumb because, if he survived, he wanted to have a plausible defense. Nobody could have figured out who actually moved the switches. Each pilot could have blamed the other. He was getting a head start with the blame game. I don't know if investigators will ever be able to figure out who actually moved the switches to the cutoff position, but if it was the pilot who asked the question, this strongly indicates sabotage. He was being deceptive. He knew exactly who moved the switches when he asked the question. Maybe he was trying to kill everyone on board the aircraft. If it was the pilot who issued the denial, it may have been sabotage, but there's a chance he didn't realize he made a mistake or he was too embarrassed to admit his mistake. This logic puzzle is interesting, but if investigators can't figure out who actually manipulated those switches, then it won't matter. Solving the logic puzzle will not help to determine what happened. Furthermore, as I mentioned, the entire logic puzzle is predicated on the fuel control switches and the computer functioning properly. With all this in mind, let's take a look at the various theories to explain why the fuel was cut off from the engines. Theory number one is that one or both of the pilots observed or had a feeling that there was some type of problem with the engines. Maybe they felt like both engines were losing thrust. The first step in the Boeing 787 checklist for a dual engine failure is moving both fuel control switches to the cutoff position, then back to the run position. This could explain why one of the pilots moved the switches. He was trying to save the aircraft. This is a good theory, but there are a few factors that contradict it. For example, there was no communication between the pilots involving engine failure. One of the pilots seemed to be confused as to why the other pilot moved the fuel control switches, and the other pilot denied moving them. During a dual engine failure, the control switches are moved from cutoff to run quickly, but it took these pilots 10 seconds to return the switches to the run position. Theory number two is that some type of muscle memory mistake occurred. One of the pilots mindlessly moved both of the fuel control switches. He didn't even realize that he did it. Maybe he was thinking about something else, distracted by current events in his life. Pilots rarely make this kind of mistake, but it is technically possible. Once the mistake was made, there was nothing that could be done to save the aircraft. Theory number 3 is murder. One of the pilots decided he wanted to kill everybody on board the aircraft. He moved the fuel control switches at a critical time, one which almost guaranteed that the result would be a catastrophe. The vast majority of the time when switches are moved, it's because a pilot intentionally moved them. Defects, vibration, accidentally bumping into a switch, all these events are possible, but unlikely. Also, when the switches were moved to the cutoff position, each switch was moved 1 second apart. When they were returned to the run position, the switches were moved 4 seconds apart. This seems like what a human would do, not a computer. Working against this theory is how the switches were returned to the run position at all. Would a saboteur be okay with trying to regain thrust? Probably not. Theory number 4 is based on the idea that the aircraft was defective in some way. There are 2 key areas of interest here: the locking mechanism on the fuel control switches and the computer, also known as the full authority digital engine control. As far as the switches, a few years earlier, the fuel control switches in the 737, which are the same switches used in the 787, were flagged for potential disengagement of the locking feature. Air India did not conduct the suggested inspections because the bulletin was advisory. It was not a directive. Maybe the switches were bumped accidentally and moved because the locking mechanism wasn't working. This, of course, doesn't explain why the switches were moved 1 second apart, which is a factor that strongly contradicts this theory. It also doesn't explain why both switches were moved. It seems strange that somebody would bump into one switch and then a second later bump into the other one. As far as the computer, the flight recorder data shows that both fuel control switches moved to the cutoff position, but that doesn't necessarily mean they were physically moved by hand. A wiring fault or internal defect could generate the same electrical signal that a computer interprets as a deliberate cutoff. A computer malfunction could explain why the pilots appeared to be taken by surprise. Maybe neither one of them was being deceptive, and they both did everything possible to save the aircraft. There was no saboteur, at least not on board the plane. When considering all the evidence in this case, how would I rank these theories from least likely to most likely? I think the least probable explanation is theory number 2, muscle memory. Then I would move to theory number 4, some type of defect with the aircraft. After this, I would go to theory number 1, the pilots accidentally shut down the engines responding to a perceived or real problem. Finally, the most probable theory would be number 3. This was murder. At this point, it would probably be a good idea for investigators to take a look at the history of the pilots. They should look for symptoms like depression, anxiety, impulsivity, a recent major loss, like separating from a romantic partner, losing custody of children, or bankruptcy. Perhaps mental health factors can shed some light on the cause of this terrible collision. Now moving to my final thoughts. What is the lesson learned in this case? Based on my theory about the most probable explanation, I would go with this lesson. No matter how well mechanical and electrical machines are constructed, they are operated by biological machines, which unfortunately can be deeply flawed. Metal fatigue, burnt wires, and all the problems with machines are relatively easy to detect. Mental health factors are far more insidious. Those are my thoughts on the case of Air India Flight 171. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you soon. I have covered all manner of disasters over the years. I've looked at aviation disasters, maritime disasters, incidents involving trains, motor vehicles, one incident involving the space station. I've looked at fatalities at amusement parks. And all of these disasters have a commonality. Usually, a person made a mistake, or there was some type of mechanical defect, or both were involved. Like it was a combination of human error and something going wrong mechanically. I find it interesting, though, how people look at these disasters initially, like at first glance, when they look at Air India Flight 171. Some people immediately thought, no, this has to be something mechanical. There's a defect. There's something wrong with the Boeing 787. Pilots would not make a mistake that could bring the plane down like that. Other people thought exactly the opposite. The plane isn't the problem. It's the pilots. They made some mistake. They broke from the procedure. Aviation is a very procedure-oriented business. It's an industry that demands some degree of rule following, a very high degree, almost a perfect degree of rule following. So clearly the rules weren't followed, because if they were, this wouldn't have happened. I think sometimes in the initial assessment, what people want to happen is projected. I think some people feel safer with the idea that there's a mechanical defect because Boeing or whoever can find it and fix it, and then it'll be solved. Other people feel safer with the idea that it was human error. They hope that when they fly, they will not experience that the pilots in their aircraft won't make mistakes. Or maybe they'll learn from the mistakes that happened in the crash, and that's why they won't make them going forward. I find it interesting where people kind of find safety. I don't think initial impressions about a disaster are always about safety. They're not always about projection, but sometimes they are. Sometimes people see what they want to see when they look at something terrible, especially something that involves a fatality or multiple fatalities, as was the case here. An unusual element of air travel is how passengers really have no control over what happens in an aircraft. They can make things worse, like they can misbehave and become a distraction, but a passenger really can't make anything better. They can't solve a problem that may take down a plane. They can't move a fuel control switch. They can't take ice off the wings. They can't change the weather. They're really just kind of there hoping that everything works out. So there is a sense of powerlessness to being a passenger, and I think it can be particularly frustrating. And again, some of the time, I think it comes out when these disasters occur, especially before the root cause is determined. I think there is a degree of people assigning a cause that makes them feel more comfortable about air travel.